When the helicopter touched down that rain-soaked evening, Chief Adrian Okoro stepped onto the wet concrete of his compound and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Standing just beyond the gate, drenched and shivering under the storm, was a 10-year-old boy with his exact face. Same deep-set eyes, same angular jaw, same thin scar beneath the left eye, a scar Adrian had carried since childhood, a mark no one else in the world shared. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the billionaire forgot how to breathe. Because if that boy was real, then everything Adrian had built his life upon was about to crumble. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. They called Adrian Okoro the Lion of Lagos, and the name carried weight across every boardroom in West Africa. At 52 years old, he controlled shipping routes, oil refineries, and real estate that stretched from Port Harcourt to Accra. His signature on a contract could change the fortunes of entire communities overnight. Politicians sought his favor. Competitors feared his next move. Yet for all his power and influence, Adrian lived alone in a mansion that echoed with emptiness. No wife, no children, no heir to carry forward the empire he had built with his bare hands and ruthless ambition. His staff whispered that he was cursed, that a man with so much wealth should not walk through life so utterly alone. Until that evening when the rain refused to stop and a boy appeared at his gate claiming to know a secret only Adrian should know. To understand what happened next, you need to know who Adrian Okoro was before the wealth, before the power, before he became untouchable. He was born in Umuahia, a town in southeastern Nigeria where red earth roads turned to mud during rainy season and dreams were considered luxuries for the foolish. His mother, Adiz, sold pepper and vegetables at the local market, rising before dawn each day. His father died of malaria when Adrian was 9 years old, leaving behind nothing but debts and disappointment. Young Adrian learned early that poverty was not just the absence of money. It was the presence of invisible walls that told you to accept your place, that whispered you would never be more than what you were born into. But Adrian refused to listen to those whispers. By 14, he was working 3 jobs, helping at the market, carrying loads for traders, washing cars for wealthy families. He attended school when he could, often arriving late with textbooks borrowed from friends because his mother could not afford to buy them. Even then, he would wake up gasping from strange dreams, describing visions of a small boy crying by a riverbank, calling out a name he could not quite hear. His mother would hold him and pray, convinced that her son carried the spirit of someone who had unfinished business in this world. She told him that some souls are born with debts they must repay, duties they must fulfill. Adrian never understood what she meant. Not until much later when it was almost too late. When Adrian turned 22, he left Umuahia with 300 naira in his pocket and a singular determination to never return poor. Lagos swallowed him whole, a city where fortunes were made and destroyed before sunset. He slept on the floor of a one-room apartment shared with 5 other men, worked as a clerk during the day, and studied international trade by candlelight at night. Within 3 years, he had saved enough to broker his first independent deal. By 30, he had negotiated his first oil contract. The deal made him his first million, and with it came access to rooms he had only imagined from outside. But even as his empire grew, the dream of the boy by the river returned every night, now accompanied by a woman's voice calling his name with a mixture of love and sorrow that made him wake up with tears on his face. Her name was Ngozi, and she represented everything Adrian had left behind in his rise to power. They had met when he was 25, during one of his rare visits back to Umuahia. She was a primary school teacher, gentle and quick to laugh, with eyes that seemed to see past all his ambition to something softer underneath. For 2 years, they would meet by the old river on the outskirts of town, and she would tell him stories about her students, about dreams that did not require millions of naira to fulfill. And for those moments, Adrian would almost believe that he could be content with a simpler life. Almost. But ambition is a jealous companion, and it does not share space with sentimentality. When Adrian's fortune began to accelerate, the visits to Umuahia became less frequent. Phone calls grew shorter, then stopped altogether. He told himself it was temporary, that once he had secured his position, he would return for her. But months turned into years, and the return never came. He heard through mutual acquaintances that Ngozi had asked about him, that she had waited, that eventually she stopped asking. Some said she had moved away. Others claimed she had fallen ill. Adrian told himself it did not matter, that he had made his choice, that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. He buried the guilt beneath layers of new deals and greater successes, until the letter arrived 12 years ago. It came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who could not identify who had hired him. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed and soft from handling. Inside was a single sheet with 7 words written in handwriting he immediately recognized as Ngozi's. "He has your eyes. Please, don't forget." No signature. No return address. No explanation. Adrian stared at those words for hours, trying to decode what they meant. He hired investigators to find her, offering substantial sums for information. They came back empty-handed. No current address. No employment records. It was as if Ngozi had disappeared from the world entirely. Eventually, Adrian convinced himself the letter was a ghost, something he could lock away and forget. He placed it in his desk drawer and tried to move forward. But the dream of the crying boy only grew more vivid, more insistent, as if time itself was running out. 12 years passed between the letter and the evening Chijiok appeared at Adrian's gate. That Sunday morning started like any other. Adrian was preparing for a video conference with investors in Houston when his head of security, Emeka, knocked urgently on his study door. The security chief was a former military man who had seen combat and never flinched, but now his face carried an expression Adrian had never witnessed, something between confusion and fear. He said there was a situation at the gate that required immediate attention. When Adrian asked what kind of situation, Emeka simply held up his phone and showed him a photograph. The image showed a small boy, maybe 10 years old, standing in the rain, staring directly at the security camera with eyes that mirrored Adrian's own. And there, beneath the left eye, was the scar. Adrian felt the room tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath his mansion had suddenly become unstable. The security chief explained that the boy had been standing there since dawn, refusing to leave, refusing to speak to anyone except Chief Okoro himself. The guards had offered to call social services, assuming he was homeless or lost, but the boy had become agitated, insisting he was not lost, that he knew exactly where he was and why he was there. He carried a school bag with an old notebook inside, and when the guards tried to examine it, he clutched it to his chest and said it was only for the chief's eyes. What would you have done if this happened to you? Would you have dismissed it as an elaborate scam? Or would you have felt that same irrational pull that Adrian felt? The sense that something impossible was demanding to be acknowledged? Adrian ordered the boy to be brought inside immediately, despite Emeka's protests about security protocols. Within minutes, Chijiok was standing in Adrian's marble-floored foyer, dripping rainwater onto expensive Italian tile, looking impossibly small against the grandeur of the mansion's entrance. Up close, the resemblance was even more disturbing. It was not just physical features but something about the way the boy held himself. A certain tilt of the head when thinking, a way of pressing his lips together before speaking that Adrian recognized from his own reflection. The household staff gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves, and Adrian could see in their faces the same unsettled recognition. This was not a child who merely looked similar. This was a child who moved like a memory made flesh. Adrian kept his voice steady as he asked the boy his name and why he had come. Chijiok, he said his name was Chijiok, spoke quietly but with an odd formality, as if he had rehearsed these words many times. He said his mother had sent him to find Chief Adrian Okoro because there was something the chief needed to know, something important that could not be written in a letter. Adrian felt his chest tighten at the mention of a mother but maintained his composure. He asked where this mother was now, why she had not come herself. The boy looked down at his bare feet and said she could not come, that she was gone but had made him promise to complete this journey. Gone. The word hung in the air with deliberate ambiguity. Then Adrian asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Who was the boy's mother? Chijioke reached into his school bag and pulled out the old notebook, its cover faded and worn. He held it out to Adrian and said that everything the chief needed to know was in there, but before Adrian read it, there was something else, something he had been told to say that would prove he was telling the truth. The boy stepped closer, so close that Adrian could see the exact pattern of the scar beneath his eye, identical in every detail. And then Chijioke whispered something. A single sentence that made Adrian's blood run cold. It was a secret that only two people in the world had ever known. Adrian and his mother, Adiz. A promise she had made him repeat on her deathbed. Words about a debt that must be repaid. About a child who would come looking for what was owed. How could this boy possibly know those words? Adrian stumbled backward, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. He demanded to know how Chijioke knew those words, who had told him, what game was being played. But the boy simply stood there, silent now, as if he had delivered the message he was sent to deliver and the rest was no longer his responsibility. Against every rational instinct, against everything his years in business had taught him about manipulation and deception, Adrian found himself unable to deny what stood before him. He ordered his staff to prepare a guest room, to find clothes and food for Chijioke, and to tell absolutely no one outside the household about the boy's presence. Then he retired to his study with the notebook, locked the door and began to read. The notebook contained entries written in Ngozi's handwriting, but they were not diary entries in the traditional sense. Instead, they read like letters to Adrian that had never been sent. The first entry was dated 3 months after their last meeting. In it, Ngozi wrote about discovering she was pregnant, about the impossible decision she faced. Tell Adrian and potentially trap him in a life he was desperately trying to escape, or raise the child alone and preserve his freedom to pursue the destiny he seemed born for. She chose silence. She chose to let him go completely, believing that his ambition required an unburdened heart and that love, real love, sometimes meant releasing someone to become who they needed to be. Would you have made the same choice? Would you have told him, or would you have done what Ngozi did, carry the weight alone? The entries continued, chronicling a pregnancy spent in a small village outside Umuahia. She wrote about the day Chijioke was born, about holding him and seeing Adrian's face staring back at her, about the joy and heartbreak of that recognition existing simultaneously. She described raising him alone, teaching him to read, telling him stories about his father without ever revealing who that father was. But as Adrian read deeper, the entries began to change. About 7 years in, Ngozi's handwriting became less steady, and she started writing about feeling unwell, about persistent fevers and weakness. By the time she finally sought proper medical care, the diagnosis came with a prognosis measured in months. The later entries were written from a hospital bed, short paragraphs punctuated by obvious gaps where pain or exhaustion had forced her to stop. And then, on the final page, a last message. If he finds you, tell him forgiveness lives by the river. Tell him the debt is not what he thinks. The investigation began with pragmatic steps. Adrian hired the most respected DNA testing facility in Lagos, paying extra for discretion and speed. He brought in private investigators who specialized in finding missing persons. He expected answers within days. Instead, he got only more questions. The DNA results came back inconclusive, not because they showed no relation, but because the samples were somehow compromised in ways the lab technicians could not explain. They ran the tests 3 times with the same bizarre results. Genetic markers that appeared and disappeared, data that seemed to shift depending on when it was analyzed. The head of the laboratory admitted she had never seen anything like it and suggested contamination, though she could not identify any source. The investigators had no better luck. They found records of a teacher named Ngozi who had worked briefly in Umuahia's school system decades ago. But the trail went cold shortly after. No current address. No tax records. No hospital admission under her name in ABA or any surrounding region. Yet when the investigators visited the villages Chijioke had mentioned, they found people who remembered her. Elderly women who recalled a beautiful, sad woman who had lived quietly with her young son, always speaking in hushed tones about a man she had loved who had gone on to do great things. But when pressed for details, memories became vague, timelines did not quite align, and certainty dissolved into ambiguity. What did remain consistent were the small details that only direct observation could have captured. Chijioke moved through Adrian's mansion with unnerving familiarity, tilting his head the same way when thinking, drumming his fingers on surfaces in the identical rhythm Adrian used when impatient, even laughing with the same brief, reluctant sound that Adrian's closest associates would recognize. The household staff began to treat the boy with a mixture of reverence and unease. Adrian found himself watching Chijioke constantly, cataloging every similarity. But the boy never asked for anything, never demanded recognition or money. He simply existed, patient and quiet, as if waiting for Adrian to arrive at a conclusion that only Adrian could reach. 3 weeks into the investigation, Adrian received a package from the investigators. Inside was an old school register and a note from a school headmistress named Mrs. Ikioma. The note said that Ngozi had left behind a box of personal items when she departed suddenly, and the school had kept them all these years. Mrs. Ikioma wrote that when she heard someone was asking about Ngozi, she felt it was time to pass along what remained. Adrian arranged to visit the school immediately, taking Chijioke with him for the first time. The drive to Amuna took them through landscapes Adrian had not seen in decades. Red earth roads, small villages where children played barefoot, open markets. It was the world he had come from, the world he had spent his adult life trying to transcend. When they arrived at the school, Mrs. Ikioma was waiting. She presented a small wooden box. Inside were letters Ngozi had written but never sent, photographs of a younger woman smiling beside a river, and at the bottom, another notebook filled with pencil drawings. Ngozi had been an artist, something Adrian had never known. The pages showed the river outside Umuahia, a young man who was unmistakably Adrian, and repeated studies of Chijioke at various ages. But it was the final drawing that made Adrian's hands shake. It showed a man and a boy standing by a river, their faces turned toward each other, and above them, written in careful letters, were the words, "Forgiveness lives by the river." Before we continue, I want to ask you something. What would you do if you discovered that your past had created a reality you never intended? A life you never knew existed until it stood before you demanding recognition? Would you embrace it? Or would you run from the responsibility? Let me know in the comments. And if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss the conclusion of stories like these. Adrian returned to Lagos with the box and a sense of inevitability settling over him. For the first time in decades, he found himself unable to focus on work. Board meetings passed in a blur. His assistants began to worry that something had changed in him. And they were right. Adrian began spending his evenings with Chijioke, not interrogating him anymore but simply existing in the same space, watching the boy do homework, listening to him talk about his favorite subjects, mathematics and poetry. The boy spoke little about his mother, but occasionally he would mention small memories. The way she hummed while cooking, her patience when teaching him to read, the stories she told about bravery and sacrifice. His board of directors began asking questions about the boy's presence. His younger brother, Chukwemeka, arrived unannounced one afternoon and demanded to know who this child was and what claim he was making on the family's wealth. Adrian's answer was simple. Chijioke was his guest, and that was all anyone needed to know. Chukwemeka spoke loudly about paternity fraud, about vultures circling wealthy men, about protecting the empire. The confrontation ended with Adrian asking his brother to leave and to not return until invited. It was the final severing of a relationship that had been dying slowly for years. His senior advisors were more subtle but equally concerned. They spoke about legal vulnerabilities, about the need for documentation before acknowledging any potential heir. They reminded him that his business rivals would use any sign of weakness against him. Adrian listened to all of this with a detachment that frightened even himself. For 30 years, he had built his empire with single-minded focus, sacrificing relationships and peace on the altar of success. And now, faced with this boy who might or might not be his son, Adrian discovered that the empire felt suddenly insignificant. What was power compared to the look in Chijioke's eyes when he smiled? What was wealth compared to the sound of a child's laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for too long? The dreams that had haunted Adrian for decades began to change. The crying boy by the river was no longer a source of anxiety but a memory that felt almost peaceful. He would wake in the darkness and find himself walking to Chijioke's door, standing outside listening to the sound of the boy's breathing, feeling a protectiveness he had never experienced before. Whether Chijioke was his biological son or something else entirely, a manifestation of guilt, a second chance offered by forces he did not understand, or simply a child who needed someone, Adrian discovered that he no longer cared about the distinction. He was choosing this. He was choosing Chijioke. 2 months after the boy's arrival, Adrian made a decision. He informed his executive team that he would be taking an extended leave of absence, something he had never done in 30 years. He delegated operational control to his most trusted managers. Then he told Chijioke to pack his bag because they were going on a journey together. The boy asked where they were going, and Adrian answered with words that felt like they had been waiting years to be spoken. They were going to find his mother, or if they could not find her, they would at least visit the places she had loved and understand who she had been. Chijioke's face lit up with an emotion so pure it almost hurt to witness. They traveled together through southeastern Nigeria, visiting the villages Ngozi had lived in, speaking with people who remembered her. In each place, Adrian learned new fragments of the woman he had loved and abandoned. She had taught literacy classes to elderly women. She had organized a cooperative that helped local farmers. She had been known for her kindness, for sitting with the sick and lonely. Adrian felt the weight of these revelations measuring the distance between who he had become and who he might have been if he had made different choices. And beside him throughout these journeys, Chijioke walked with quiet gravity, as if he were a guide leading Adrian through territories of memory and consequence. The final stop was the river outside Umuahia, the place where Adrian and Ngozi had spent countless afternoons in what now felt like a different lifetime. The river had not changed. It still moved with the same steady current, still reflected the sky in fractured patterns. Adrian stood on the bank where he had stood as a young man full of dreams, and felt the ghost of who he had been overlaying who he had become. Chijioke stood beside him, and for a long time neither spoke. Then the boy reached into his school bag and pulled out one final item, a sealed envelope that he said his mother had told him to give to Adrian only when they reached the river together. The letter inside was dated 2 days before Ngozi's death. Her handwriting was barely legible, weakened by illness, but the words carried a clarity that pain could not diminish. She wrote that she was not angry, had never been angry, and did not want Adrian to carry anger toward himself. She wrote that the choices they had both made were not wrong, merely inevitable given who they were. She wrote that Chijioke was real, was theirs, was a gift she had been grateful to carry alone because it meant Adrian's wings remained unclipped. But she also wrote something else. Chijioke was not just her son. He carried their combined spirit, their shared dreams, the best parts of who they had been before ambition and illness had separated them. And then the final line, "When you look at him, remember to look at yourself with the same love. That is the forgiveness I'm asking you to find." Adrian looked up from the letter to find Chijioke watching him with infinite patience. And then the boy spoke, his voice clear in the morning air. "Mama said when your heart was ready, you would see her again." He pointed toward a bend in the river where morning mist was still rising from the water's surface. Adrian followed the gesture and saw, or thought he saw, a figure standing there. A woman in white, her outline soft against the dawn light, her face turned toward them. For a moment that existed outside of time, Adrian felt Ngozi's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, just a moment of recognition, of acknowledgement, of something being completed that had long remained unfinished. He blinked and the figure was gone. When he turned back to say something to Chijioke, the boy was no longer beside him. Adrian spun around, calling his name, searching the riverbank. Nothing. No footprints in the soft earth. No sound of running feet. No trace that anyone had been there at all except Adrian himself. He ran along the river's edge, shouting for Chijioke, panic rising in his chest. But the morning was silent except for the sound of water moving over stones. The boy had simply vanished, as completely as if he had never existed. Adrian returned to his car in a daze and ordered his driver to search every road, every village, every possible location. He called Emeka and deployed his entire security team. He contacted local police, offered rewards, demanded answers. For 3 days they searched. They found nothing. No child matching Chijioke's description. No reports of a missing boy. The school register that had listed him as a student could no longer be found. Mrs. Ikioma searched her office repeatedly, but the document had somehow disappeared. The notebook with Ngozi's drawings, the letters, the photographs, all of it remained proof that something had happened. But the boy himself had evaporated like morning mist. On the 4th day, Adrian returned to his mansion exhausted and broken. He walked to his bedroom and stood before the full-length mirror, something he rarely did anymore. And that was when he noticed it. The scar beneath his left eye, the scar that had marked him since he was 10 years old, the scar that Chijioke had shared, was gone. The skin was smooth, unmarked, as if the wound had never existed. Adrian touched his face in disbelief, ran his fingers over the spot where tissue had been raised and discolored for over 40 years. Nothing. He checked old photographs to confirm he was not losing his mind. There it was in every image, the familiar mark. But now, in the present, it had vanished completely. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Adrian's life. He became a man obsessed with understanding what had happened, hiring experts in psychology, medicine, and even, though he would never admit this publicly, spiritual practitioners who claimed to understand things that existed beyond material explanation. None of them could tell him anything definitive. The psychologists suggested elaborate theories about trauma and manifestation. The doctors had no explanation for the disappearing scar. The spiritual practitioners spoke in vague terms about debts being paid, about spirits completing unfinished journeys, about the thin places where the living and the dead could briefly touch. But while Adrian searched for explanations, something inexplicable continued to happen. Every morning, without fail, he would find a single wildflower on his desk, fresh, with drops of river water still clinging to its petals. It would appear overnight, though his security system showed no one entering his study. He would throw them away, lock his door, even sleep in his study to catch whoever was leaving them. Still, each dawn brought a new flower. His staff swore they had nothing to do with it. Some said it was the wind. Others suggested more unsettling possibilities. But Adrian knew, in a way that went deeper than logic, exactly what it meant. It was a reminder, a message from someone who could no longer speak but still needed to be heard. The servants began reporting other occurrences. A gardener swore he saw a child running through the grounds at dawn, barefoot and laughing, disappearing behind the hedges before he could get close. A housemaid heard a young voice singing in one of the empty guest rooms, though when she opened the door, the room was vacant and silent. The night security guard claimed he sometimes saw movement on the surveillance cameras. A small figure crossing the garden, always just out of clear view, always gone when he went to investigate. Adrian listened to these reports with a strange mixture of grief and comfort. Perhaps Chijioke had not left entirely. Perhaps some part of him remained, tethered to this place, completing whatever purpose had brought him here. Do you think the boy was real? Or was he something else? A manifestation of guilt, a spiritual messenger, a final gift from a woman who had loved too deeply and sacrificed too much? The truth is, Adrian stopped trying to answer that question. Because real or not, biological son or spiritual visitation, Chijioke had changed him in ways that could not be undone. The man who had built an empire on ruthless ambition discovered that wealth meant nothing if it was not shared, that power meant nothing if it was not used to lift others, that success meant nothing if you reached the end of your life alone. The transformation began quietly. Adrian started redirecting portions of his wealth toward causes he had previously ignored. He funded the construction of schools in rural communities across southeastern Nigeria, ensuring that children who reminded him of his younger self would have opportunities he had nearly been denied. He built hospitals in areas where medical care was scarce, remembering how Ngozi had died because treatment came too late. He established scholarship programs for children who had lost parents, thinking of Chijioke and the mother who had raised him alone. His board of directors were initially confused, then concerned, then quietly supportive as they watched their leader discover something resembling peace. He returned to Umuahia for the first time in decades, not as a conquering hero but as a son remembering his origins. He renovated his mother's grave, which had been neglected in his years of absence. He visited the market where Adiz had sold vegetables, and quietly funded a cooperative that would provide better facilities and fair prices for the women who still worked there. He walked through streets he had once run through as a hungry child, and saw himself in every young face that stared at him with a mixture of hope and desperation. He established a foundation named for Ngozi, though he never explained publicly who she was or why she deserved to be honored. Those who knew, knew. Those who didn't would never understand anyway. The business empire continued to function, but Adrian was no longer its beating heart. He had trained successors, delegated authority, created systems that could survive without him. He spent less time in boardrooms and more time visiting the schools and hospitals his money had built, talking to children who had no idea who he was, listening to teachers and doctors describe the difference his funding had made. In those moments, he would sometimes see Chijioke's face in the crowd. A trick of light, a boy who happened to resemble him, a memory overlaying present reality. He never tried to approach these moments. He simply acknowledged them and moved on, carrying them like photographs in a wallet, evidence of something precious that had been briefly held and then released. His family remained distant, unable to understand the change in him. His business associates whispered that he had experienced a breakdown, that grief or guilt had finally caught up with him. Let them whisper, Adrian thought. Their opinions no longer carried the weight they once had. He had spent decades building an empire to prove his worth to people whose approval meant nothing. Now he was building something different, not monuments to his success but quiet acts of service that would outlive his name. He began saying something that confused everyone who heard it. Some debts are paid in silence. When pressed to explain, he would simply smile and change the subject. At night, alone in his mansion, Adrian would sometimes stand by the window looking out toward the river that flowed somewhere beyond the city lights. He would think about Ngozi, about the life they might have lived if he had made different choices. He would think about Chijioke, about whether the boy had been real or something else entirely. And he would feel the absence of the scar beneath his eye, running his fingers over smooth skin where a mark had lived for 4 decades. Felt like forgiveness made tangible. It felt like being released from something he had carried so long he had forgotten it was a burden. The wildflowers continued to appear each morning, and Adrian stopped questioning them. He would find them on his desk with dew still fresh on their petals, and he would place them in water, letting them brighten his study for a few days before they faded. It became a ritual, a quiet conversation with someone who might or might not still exist somewhere beyond his understanding. And in that daily exchange of beauty offered and received, Adrian found something he had never possessed in all his years of wealth and power: gratitude. Not for what he had accumulated, but for what he had been given and lost and was now, somehow, being given again in a different form. Chief Adrian Okoro died 7 years after Chijioke appeared at his gate. He was 59 years old, still relatively young, but his health had been declining for months. He refused aggressive treatment, telling his doctors that he had made his peace with whatever came next. On his final night, the nurses reported something strange. Around midnight, when they checked on him, he seemed to be having a conversation with someone they could not see. He was smiling, occasionally nodding, speaking in a voice so soft they could not make out the words. When they asked if he needed anything, he waved them away gently and said he was exactly where he needed to be. The night security guard at his estate reported seeing 2 figures walking across the grounds just before dawn. One tall, one small, moving hand in hand toward the section of the property that bordered the old river. When he went to investigate, he found nothing except fresh footprints in the dew-covered grass. 2 sets of prints, one large and one small, leading to the river's edge and then disappearing. By the time the sun rose fully, Adrian's heart monitor had flatlined, and the medical staff declared him dead. But those who had been with him in his final hours swore his face held an expression of profound relief, as if he had been waiting for something and it had finally arrived. His will stunned everyone. The majority of his fortune was placed in trusts dedicated to education, healthcare, and supporting single mothers across Nigeria. His siblings received modest inheritances with strict conditions about how the money could be used. The mansion was to be converted into a school and orphanage, serving children who had lost parents or been abandoned. And in a clause that confused his lawyers, he left instructions that a small garden be maintained by the river on the property, with wildflowers planted each season. Flowers that required no one to tend them, that would grow and reseed themselves year after year without human intervention. The funeral was attended by thousands, politicians, business leaders, people whose lives had been changed by his late-stage philanthropy. But the most poignant moment came from an unexpected source. An elderly woman approached the casket, a woman no one recognized, and placed a faded photograph beside the flowers. The image showed a young man and a young woman sitting by a river, laughing, their whole lives still ahead of them. On the back, written in handwriting that matched the notebooks Adrian had kept locked in his study, were the words, "We were always meant to find each other again." No one knew who the woman was. By the time people thought to ask, she had disappeared into the crowd and was never seen again. In the years since Adrian's death, the school built in his mansion has educated hundreds of children. Teachers there sometimes report unusual occurrences. The sound of a child laughing in empty hallways, the feeling of being watched by someone benevolent, and most frequently, the appearance of wildflowers in places they should not grow. Fresh flowers on windowsills, petals scattered across classroom floors, blooms appearing overnight in the middle of winter. The children who attend the school have started a tradition. When they find these unexpected flowers, they press them into their books as bookmarks, believing they bring good luck on exams and protection during difficult times. Perhaps they are right. If the story has moved you, if it has made you think about the choices you've made and the debts you might owe, not debts of money but debts of love, of attention, of presence, then please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Because every week, we bring you stories that explore the deepest parts of the human experience, stories that remind us we are more than our successes or failures, more than the empires we build or the regrets we carry. So let me leave you with this question. Was Chijioke real? Was he Adrian's biological son? A boy of flesh and blood who vanished for reasons we cannot explain? Or was he something else? A spiritual messenger, a manifestation of guilt made tangible, a final gift from a woman who loved too deeply to let go completely? And does the answer even matter? Because real or not, that boy changed the trajectory of a man's life. He turned a ruthless billionaire into someone who understood that wealth means nothing if you reach the end alone, that power means nothing if you never learn to be vulnerable, that success means nothing if you cannot look at yourself with love. What would you have done in Adrian's position? If a child appeared at your door claiming to be yours, carrying secrets no stranger should know, wearing your face like a mirror held up to your past, would you have embraced the mystery, or would you have run from it? And more importantly, what debts are you carrying right now? What people have you left behind in your climb toward whatever summit you are chasing? What loves have you abandoned, telling yourself you would return to them later, when the time was right, knowing somewhere deep down that later might never come? Comment below and let me know. Do you believe Chijioke was real, or was he something beyond our understanding? Do you think Adrian found redemption, or do you think some debts can never truly be repaid? And have you ever felt visited by your own past, by choices you made or did not make, demanding that you finally pay attention and make things right before time runs out completely? And remember, some mirrors don't show your face, they show your soul. The question is, when you look into that mirror, what do you see? A person who has built empires but lost themselves in the process? Or someone who understands that the truest measure of a life is not what you accumulate but what you give away, not how high you climb but who you lift as you rise? Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories that haunt you, challenge you, and remind you that we are all walking around with invisible debts and unfinished business. Stories that suggest the universe sometimes gives us second chances, delivered in forms we never expect, at moments when we need them most desperately. Because whether or not you believe in spirits or manifestations or the supernatural, one truth remains undeniable. We are haunted by what we leave behind. The question is whether we will acknowledge those ghosts, make our peace with them, and finally learn to forgive ourselves. Thank you for watching. Until the next story, remember, some debts are paid in silence, but the most important ones are paid in changed lives, in transformed hearts, in the quiet courage to become better than you were. And maybe, just maybe, that is what Chijioke came to teach Adrian all along.